He was not what you'd expect a traitor to look like. No hollow eyes, no trembling hands. Judas Iscariot was sharp, organized, trusted. He was the man Jesus chose to hold the money, to manage the provisions, track the costs, keep the ministry moving across the dust roads of Galilee and Judea. He had walked with Jesus for 3 years. 3 years of watching the blind see. 3 years of watching lepers weep into hands they hadn't felt in decades. 3 years of miracles he couldn't explain and power he couldn't deny. And still, something had been breaking inside him, quietly, the way ice fractures before it falls. He had followed Jesus expecting a throne, a kingdom, Rome driven out in fire and triumph. Instead, Jesus kept talking about suffering, about dying. And so Judas made a calculation, not about money, about control. 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something real. Have you ever believed in someone so deeply and then let disappointment quietly turn into something dangerous? Judas didn't become a traitor overnight. It happened slowly, silently, one unmet expectation at a time. If a story like this is already stirring something in you, something about trust, about faith, about the choices we make when hope feels delayed, take a moment right now to subscribe and like this video. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from today. Because what happens next in this story, you are not prepared for. Miriam had lived in Jerusalem her entire life. She knew this city the way a mother knows a restless child, its rhythms, its moods, its seasons of unease. And this Passover season felt wrong in a way she couldn't name. The crowds were larger than any year she could remember. Pilgrims from Egypt, from Galilee, from the far edges of the empire, all pressing through the city gates with their lambs and their prayers and their ancient longing for something to change. Then 5 days ago, everything shifted. She had seen him, just briefly, just a glimpse through the crowd, a man on a donkey moving through a sea of cloaks thrown across the road. But something about that moment had reached inside her chest and pulled. Now she watched the temple guards moving in formations she had never seen before, priests whispering in clusters too tight for ordinary conversation. Something was being planned. She didn't know his name, but the lone figure she spotted crossing the street below, moving fast, moving away from the disciples' camp, heading toward the temple complex, made her stop breathing. Something about the way he walked felt like a door quietly closing on the world she knew. Caiaphas had not reached the position of high priest by being careless. 20 years of careful maneuvering, 20 years of managing Rome's expectations while keeping the temple's power intact. He had survived emperors, governors, and uprisings that swallowed lesser men whole. But this was different. 5 days ago, Jesus of Nazareth had ridden into Jerusalem to the sound of 1,000 voices shouting his name. Then he walked into the temple courts and overturned the money changers' tables, scattered coins and birds and years of carefully maintained order across the sacred floor. Called the house of God a den of robbers, in front of thousands of Passover pilgrims. Every time Jesus spoke in the temple courts, the crowd grew larger. Every miracle reported made him harder to dismiss. And a crowd that large, that devoted, that volatile, during Passover, was one spark away from the kind of riot that would bring Roman soldiers into the streets and end everything Caiaphas had spent his life protecting. He told himself he was preserving peace. He told himself one man's removal was a small price for the nation's survival. What he could not see, what he refused to see, was that the equation was already running against him. It started with perfume. 6 days before Passover, in a warm house in Bethany, a woman walked in carrying an alabaster jar. The fragrance hit the room before she reached the table, rich, overwhelming, the kind of scent that costs a working man an entire year's wages. She broke the jar open and poured every drop over Jesus. The room went silent. Then Judas spoke. "Why wasn't this sold and the money given to the poor?" He said it like a reasonable man asking a reasonable question, but something underneath it was neither reasonable nor generous. Judas held the money bag. He tracked every coin that moved through the ministry, and watching that perfume pour out, watching what he calculated as an entire year's budget dissolve into the air, something cold moved through him. Jesus defended her immediately, publicly, clearly, without hesitation. He said she had done a beautiful thing. He said what she did would be remembered wherever the gospel was told. Judas sat back down. But the correction landed differently than Jesus intended. Not as a lesson, not as grace. It landed as humiliation, as proof that his judgment didn't matter, that his voice carried no weight at this table. He didn't leave that night, but something inside him had already walked out the door. The crack that had been forming for months, quietly, invisibly, had just grown wide enough to let the darkness in. There is a moment in every wrong decision when a man can still turn back. Judas passed that moment the second he walked through the door. The room was quiet. Lamplight, incense, the kind of stillness that felt less like peace and more like something waiting. Caiaphas sat at the center, robes immaculate, expression unreadable. The other priests arranged themselves around him like men who already knew how this meeting would end. Judas had told himself he was forcing Jesus' hand, that once the arrest happened, Jesus would finally reveal his power, call down angels, overthrow Rome, become the king everyone had been waiting for. He had built an entire story around what he was about to do. The priests exchanged a single glance, then a pouch appeared on the table. 30 pieces of silver. Not a king's ransom, not even a wealthy man's transaction. 30 coins, the legal price of a slave under the law of Moses. Common, calculated, almost insulting in its smallness. Judas reached out, his fingers touched the coins, and in that moment, that single, irreversible moment, something closed inside him that had never been closed before. Not the door behind him, something deeper, something that, once shut, could not be easily reopened. He walked out into the night with 30 coins and a plan. What he left behind in that room was something he wouldn't fully understand until it was far too late. 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. Not a fortune, 30 coins. Think about that for a moment. This man had watched Jesus raise the dead. He had sat at the same table. He had heard the same teaching. And still, something else won. I want to ask you honestly, have you ever been in a place where you knew the right thing and still chose something else? Where the gap between what you believed and what you did became wider than you expected? If this story is reaching somewhere real inside you right now, subscribe and like the video so you can walk this road to the very end. Because the most devastating part of this story hasn't happened yet. John noticed things others missed. That was simply who he was. While Peter argued and Thomas questioned and the others debated loudly over bread and wine, John watched. He listened beneath the words. He paid attention to the silences. And tonight, the silences were saying everything. The upper room was warm, low table, lamplight, the smell of unleavened bread and wine, and the particular closeness of men who had spent 3 years walking the same roads together. Outside the window, Jerusalem burned with Passover fires. Inside, it felt like any other supper, except it didn't. Jesus moved differently tonight, spoke more slowly. Every sentence carried a weight that John couldn't name, but couldn't ignore. And then, midway through the meal, Jesus stopped. "Truly I tell you," he said quietly, "one of you will betray me." The room fractured instantly. Every man looked at every other man. Questions collided across the table. John leaned close to Jesus, whispering urgently, asking who it was. Jesus answered him. John looked up. His eyes found Judas across the table, and Judas's face was perfectly, deliberately still. The face of a man performing an emotion he did not feel. Jesus dipped bread, handed it to Judas. Their eyes met briefly. Then Judas stood up, quietly pushed back from the table, and walked out. The door opened to the night, then closed. John sat very still, watching that closed door, turning over everything he had just seen, and wondering why he hadn't said something sooner. Nobody told Ezra what, exactly, they were arresting Jesus for. They just handed him a torch, strapped a sword to his side, and told him to follow orders. He was 23 years old, a priest's son. He had grown up in the shadow of the temple, memorizing the law, learning the rituals, trusting the men who ran the sacred machinery of Israel's worship. If the chief priests said this man was dangerous, then this man was dangerous. That was what he told himself as the arrest party moved through Jerusalem's empty streets before dawn. The city was stripped down to silence at this hour. Shuttered stalls, cold cooking fires, the distant bark of a dog somewhere beyond the city walls. Ezra's torch threw long shadows across the limestone as he walked, the sound of sandals and sword hilts filling the narrow corridor of the street. Then they crossed the Kidron Valley and began climbing toward the Mount of Olives. That was when Ezra heard it, drifting through the ancient olive trees, low, anguished, barely above a whisper, the sound of a man praying like his life depended on it. Not performing, not reciting, genuinely crying out to God from somewhere deep and desperate and completely unguarded. Ezra slowed his steps. The soldier ahead shoved him forward. He kept walking, but something about that voice stayed with him, lodged somewhere beneath his ribs, like a question he hadn't been asked yet. Gethsemane meant oil press, a place where olives were crushed under enormous weight until everything inside them poured out. On this night, the name felt unbearable in its accuracy. Jesus moved deeper into the garden, away from the sleeping disciples, until the ancient trees swallowed the last of the torchlight from the city below. The ground was cold. The air carried the sharp green scent of olive leaves and turned earth. Somewhere above the canopy, a sky full of Passover stars burned indifferently on. He went down to his knees, then further, face pressed against the earth, hands flat on the ground, the full weight of what was coming pressing down on him with a force no human language has ever adequately described. This was not a performance of anguish. This was a man who knew, with complete, clear, unsparing awareness, exactly what the next 12 hours held. Every detail, every wound, every moment of abandonment and humiliation and physical destruction. He faced it without illusion, without distance, without the mercy of not knowing. And he prayed, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." There it was, the full weight of human vulnerability laid completely bare. Not weakness, not failing faith, just a man pressing his face to the cold ground and asking, with everything in him, if there was another way. 3 times he prayed it. 3 times he walked back to find his disciples sleeping. 3 times he returned to the same crushing, clarifying answer. And each time, he pressed through his own anguish back to the same words, the most powerful words ever spoken in that garden, or any garden in the history of the world. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours. The trembling stopped. Something settled in his expression that had not been there before. Not relief, not peace exactly, but the deep, unshakable resolve of a man who has chosen obedience at the highest possible cost and will not be moved from it. He stood, he looked back toward the city, and through the olive trees, distant at first, then growing, came the warm, flickering glow of torches moving in the dark. Of all the ways a man could betray someone, a lie, a rumor, a knife in the dark, Judas chose the most intimate gesture in the human vocabulary. A kiss. He had rehearsed it. He knew exactly what to do. Walk straight to Jesus, greet him by name, make contact. Give the soldiers their signal. Clean, efficient, over in seconds. What he had not rehearsed was what Jesus would say. The arrest party moved through the garden with torches cutting through the darkness between the olive trees. Soldiers, temple guards, swords and clubs, and the heavy breathing of men prepared for resistance. And walking at the front of all of it, Judas. He crossed the garden with steady steps. He stopped directly in front of Jesus. And Jesus was already looking at him. Not searching the darkness for the source of the noise, not startled, not stepping back, just looking at Judas with the full, calm, heartbreaking awareness of a man who had known this moment was coming and had chosen to stay anyway. Judas opened his mouth. "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. One word came back, not a curse, not a condemnation, not the righteous fury of a king betrayed by his closest circle. One word, friend. That word did something to Judas that the 30 coins never did. That word reached past every calculation, every justification, every carefully constructed story he had built around what he was doing. And it cracked something open that could not be closed again. The soldiers surged forward. Chaos erupted around them. Peter's sword flashed. Jesus healed the wounded man immediately. A miracle of mercy performed in the middle of his own arrest, and then allowed himself to be led away. Judas stood completely still. Everyone moved around him, soldiers, priests, disciples scattering into the dark. He stood there holding 30 coins in a garden that had gone, suddenly, absolutely quiet. And for the first time since that lamplight room, he had no plan for what came next. 2 men stood face to face in that garden. One came with soldiers and a signal. The other came with a single word, friend. Think about what that means. Jesus knew exactly what Judas had done. He knew every detail of the deal, every coin, every conversation in that lamplight room, and he still called him friend. Not because the betrayal didn't matter, but because love, real love, does not stop being love just because it has been wounded. If that word is landing somewhere inside you right now, if you've ever needed someone to call you friend after you didn't deserve it, type the word friend in the comments right now. And if you want to keep receiving Bible stories that go this deep, subscribe and like this video, because what happens next to Peter will shake you in a completely different way. Peter had meant every word. Earlier that night, when Jesus warned that all the disciples would fall away, Peter had been the loudest voice in the room, the most certain, the most passionate. Even if everyone else abandoned Jesus, not him, never him. He would go to prison. He would die first. He meant it. That is the most important thing to understand about what happened next. Peter followed the arrest party at a distance, slipping through the shadows into the courtyard of the high priest's house. He found a fire, a small coal fire where servants and guards had gathered against the cold, and pressed himself into the edge of the group, trying to disappear into the ordinary warmth of it. Then a servant girl looked at him. "You were with him," she said. "The man from Galilee." "I don't know what you're talking about." Simple, quick. The words were out before he fully processed what he had said. He moved away from the fire. Another person recognized him. He denied it again, louder this time, with the particular force of a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. The third denial came with an oath. Then the rooster crowed. And in that precise, devastating moment, Jesus was being led through the courtyard. He turned. Their eyes met across the open stone space. Jesus in chains, Peter standing at the edge of a fire, and no words crossed between them. No accusation, no anger, just that look. Peter walked out of the courtyard and wept with the particular grief of a man who had just watched himself become someone he never believed he could be. The difference between Peter and Judas was never the failure. It was always what came after. Morning light is supposed to bring clarity. For Judas, it brought something far worse. He had spent the night telling himself that Jesus would stop it, that somewhere between the garden and the trial, the power Judas had watched for 3 years would finally detonate. Angels descending, Rome collapsing, the kingdom arriving in fire and undeniable glory. He had convinced himself that his betrayal was a catalyst, not a crime. But the sun rose over Jerusalem, and Jesus was still in chains. And the verdict was already moving through the city like a cold wind. Judas walked back to the temple with the 30 coins burning in his fist. The morning priests moved through their routines, incense, prayer, the ordinary sacred machinery of a new day, as though nothing was wrong, as though the world had not shifted completely on its foundation overnight. He found the chief priests. He threw the coins, all 30 of them scattered across the sacred temple floor, spinning and rolling and catching the morning light in a way that felt almost obscene given what they represented. "I have sinned," he said. His voice was raw, stripped of every calculation he had walked in with the night before. "I have betrayed innocent blood." The priests looked at him the way powerful men look at tools they have already finished using. "What is that to us? That's your problem." And they walked away. They simply walked away. The coins lay on the temple floor. Too contaminated for the treasury, the priests would later decide. 30 pieces of silver that had purchased the most catastrophic transaction in human history, now too dirty even for the house of God. Judas stood alone in the middle of it. Confession without mercy is just a man standing in an empty room, hearing his own words echo back at him with nowhere to go. He had said the right words. He had felt the right grief. But he turned in the wrong direction. Malachi had worked this land for 40 years. His hands knew every rise and dip of its clay soil, every stubborn stone, every place where the earth ran rich and dark after rain. It wasn't beautiful land. It wasn't productive land. But it was his, and he understood it the way an old man understands the things that have shaped him, quietly, completely, without needing to explain it to anyone. The priests came on an ordinary morning. They were brief, businesslike, almost impatient, the kind of men who needed a transaction completed quickly and without conversation. They had coins. They wanted the land. They named a price that was fair enough that refusing felt pointless. Malachi signed the deed. He walked to the gate of his field and looked back one final time. The old wheel at the edge of the plot, the clay-dark soil, the particular way the morning light fell across the low ground after sunrise. Then he walked away. He never learned why the priests had been in such a hurry. He never learned what his field would become. A burial ground for strangers, purchased with blood money, its new name spreading quietly across Jerusalem in the weeks that followed. Akeldama, the field of blood. Centuries earlier, a prophet named Zechariah had written about 30 pieces of silver being thrown to a potter. Malachi never read that passage, but standing at his gate that morning, looking back at land he would never touch again, something in him felt the strange, heavy presence of a moment far larger than he could see. He just couldn't say why. Ezra had stood at the edges of many things in his life. He was a man who followed orders, filled his post, completed his assignment, and went home. That was the job. That was the life. He had never needed it to be more than that. But standing at the edge of Golgotha on a Friday morning, watching 3 men nailed to wooden crosses against a pale Jerusalem sky, something in Ezra's chest refused to stay quiet. He had been there in the garden. He had carried the torch. He had helped deliver this man to the people who wanted him dead. That was simply a fact he could not unfasten from himself, no matter how many orders had been given between that moment and this one. The crowd pressed in from every direction, priests, soldiers, pilgrims, the grieving, the curious, the cruel. The noise was overwhelming, mockery from some, weeping from others. The particular brutality of a public execution designed to send a message to anyone watching. Then, at noon, the sky went dark. Not a cloud passing over the sun, not weather rolling in from the coast. The sky simply closed, full darkness, at midday, over Jerusalem. The crowd went silent in a way crowds almost never go silent, suddenly, completely, as though the air itself had issued a command. For 3 hours, the darkness held. Then Jesus cried out, a sound that came from somewhere beyond physical pain, beyond ordinary suffering, and he was gone. The earth moved beneath Ezra's feet, and then, visible above the rooftops of Jerusalem from where he stood, the temple veil tore. Not from the bottom up, the way a man would tear it, from the top down, as though something on the other side had simply decided the barrier no longer needed to exist. Ezra looked at his hands, the same hands that had gripped a torch in Gethsemane. The Roman centurion standing nearby broke the silence first. "Surely," he said quietly, "this was the Son of God." Ezra said nothing, but his hands were trembling, and every certainty he had carried into that garden the night before was now lying in pieces around his feet, leaving behind something raw and open and terrifying that felt, against all reason, remarkably like the beginning of faith. Everyone else ran. That is simply what happened. When the soldiers came in the garden, when the arrest became real, when the danger of association became undeniable, the disciples scattered into the darkness. Peter followed at a distance and then denied 3 times that he even knew the man. The others disappeared entirely. Mary Magdalene stayed, not because she was unafraid, but because she had a category for loyalty that fear could not override. Jesus had found her at the lowest point of her life, broken, discarded, written off by everyone who knew her name, and he had called her back from the edge of herself. She had no framework for walking away from that, no calculation that made leaving make sense. So she stood at the cross through all 3 hours of darkness. She watched them take his body down. She followed the small procession to the tomb, a new garden, a rich man's grave, a stone rolled across the entrance with a sound of finality that pressed against her ribs like a physical weight. The other women turned to leave. Mary stood at the sealed stone for a long moment, her hand pressed flat against its cold surface. Then she turned and walked slowly back toward the city. But she had counted every step between the road and that tomb. She had noted the angle of the entrance, the position of the stone, the exact distance from the garden gate. She was already planning to return. What she could not know, what none of them could know, was what she would find when she did. A stone rolled away, an empty grave, and a name spoken in a garden, in a voice she would have recognized anywhere in the world. A coin, 30 of them. That was the number a man put on the most important relationship of his life, and the number the world put on the Son of God. Think about what happened to every person in this story. Caiaphas got what he wanted, the arrest, the trial, the verdict, and within 40 years, the temple he had spent his life protecting was reduced to ash and scattered stone by the very Roman Empire he had tried so hard not to provoke. Every political calculation he made dissolved. Judas confessed. He said the words, he felt the grief, but he turned away from the only source of mercy that could have actually received him. That door was never locked. He simply could not bring himself to open it. Peter wept, and because he wept, because he let the grief break him open instead of harden him, he was found again, restored. The man who denied Jesus 3 times became the man who declared him to thousands on the day the world changed. Mary never stopped showing up, and she became the first human voice to carry the most important news in history. Ezra went home with trembling hands and a torn certainty that would slowly, quietly rebuild into something unshakable. And the potter's field, purchased with blood money, too contaminated for the treasury, became a burial ground for strangers, fulfilling, word for word, a prophecy written 5 centuries before Judas was born. Divine purpose does not require human cooperation to succeed, but human choices still open doors, or close them. The cross that Judas helped build became the very instrument of the redemption he had stopped believing was possible. The price he thought he was negotiating, 30 coins, 1 life, turned out to be the down payment on something no amount of silver could have purchased. A coin. 30 of them. The price a man put on everything, and somewhere else entirely, on a hill, on a cross, in the silence between a death and an empty grave, the price of everything else was paid in full. Before you go, I want to ask you something I genuinely want you to think about. Of every person in this story, Judas, Peter, Caiaphas, Mary, Ezra standing at the edge of the crowd, which one felt most familiar to you? Not who you wanted to be, who you actually recognized, because that is where this story really lives. Not in the distance of 2,000 years, but in the choices we make when no one is watching, when the coins are on the table, when the rooster crows, when the stone is rolled across everything we hoped for. Tell me in the comments, which moment in this story hit you the hardest? I genuinely want to know. And if you believe that stories like this, told this way, still have the power to change something in a person, subscribe and like this video right now, because the next story coming to this channel carries the same weight, and you will not want to miss it.